Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Kennelly, and I am pleased to be here with you today to discuss the story of the Bible. If you're watching this, then I know your parents were smart enough and kind enough to get you this groundbreaking new series from Tan Books. It's going to be my job to go through each chapter with you after you've read it. At this point, you should have read the introduction as well as chapter 1. We'll touch briefly on chapter 2, but you shouldn't have read that by now. You can have your books with you as we do these little chapter reviews, but it's not necessary. We mainly just want you to sit back and relax and sort of go on this journey with me as we journey through the Old Testament together. Now, when we talk about the Bible, we have to ask a simple question. What is it? Well, it's a book, right? It's got a front cover and a back cover and pages in between and words all over the pages. So in that way, it sort of resembles a book, yeah. But it's more than that, isn't it? Think about your mom and dad for a second. Are they just two human beings? Are they just two people that you kind of know? No, of course not. There's a deeper connection that you have with your parents. And just like that, we need to have a deeper connection with the Bible. And so we have to read it and learn from it and study it and examine it and ultimately come to love it and come to have that deeper connection. Now, when I say study and examine, don't let that scare you. This isn't going to be like looking at a math book or a science book. We're not going to study math equations or the periodic table of elements. And that's because none of those things are found in the Bible. The Bible is filled with stories. Lots and lots and lots of stories. Stories of war and betrayal and love and adventure. Lots of stories that you're probably already familiar with a little bit because they're going to sound a lot like the stories that you know of today. Stories that you see in movies and TV shows and read in other books. They're the same types of themes, just told with different characters. We just talked about your mom and dad a second ago. Think about it like this. You could say that the Bible is like the mother and father of all the other stories that are alive in the world. Just like children look like their mom and dad, just like they resemble them, the stories that are alive today, they resemble those stories from the Bible. So we're going to journey way back in time to when the first human beings walked the earth, Adam and Eve, who we'll talk about in a second. And we'll journey through and talk about Noah and Moses and a lot of these other people that you're probably at least already a little bit familiar with. But even though we're going to journey way back in time, the cool thing about the Bible is that it can actually teach us about the world today in which we live and the world to come. And it can teach us about our own selves and how we relate to God and how we relate to other people. So there's going to be a lot of things that we pull from each lesson. We're going to talk about the actual events of the Bible, and we're going to go through what happened. But then we're also going to talk about certain lessons that we want to pull from the Bible. Now, in your introduction, you should have read about the book of nature. Well, what is that? That's just a way to sort of describe the world of nature all around us. The trees and the moon and the oceans and lakes and rivers, all that sort of stuff. It helps us to understand the world around us better to call it the book of nature because we like to think of God as the author. Just like an author writes words upon a page, God wrote upon the face of the earth. And just like we can learn about an author by reading his book, we can learn about God by looking at the book of nature. So when we look at a beautiful sunset going down beyond the ocean, we know that God is beautiful because that sunset is beautiful. When we see a river rushing through a canyon and we see it just running through the land, we know that God is powerful because we see that that river is powerful. Think of it like this. When you look into a mirror, you're looking at a reflection of yourself. So if I were to look at a mirror, I could see I'm wearing a blue shirt and a dark sport coat. Well, when we look into nature, it's sort of like we're looking at a reflection of God. So again, when we see that beautiful sunset, we know that God is beautiful. But as wonderful as the book of nature is, and it is something we should cherish and appreciate, there are things, deeper things in the world that we need to understand and appreciate even more. And we call these things supernatural truths. Now, supernatural truths are very difficult to understand, even for the wisest adult, so of course it's going to be difficult for a young child. But the good news is that God gave us another book to help us understand these supernatural truths, and that of course is the Bible. God inspired great men of the Bible, the prophets, to write down all these stories that we're going to talk about, and all these bits of wisdom. He inspired them to write these things down so that he might explain these supernatural truths to us. And we'll talk about each one as we go through each chapter. Now, supernatural truths, again, they're very difficult to understand. So when I get to one, we'll really want to focus on that because the Bible is filled with stories and those stories are great. But the important thing is to take the lesson away from each story. and the lesson is the story of these supernatural truths. So God inspired these men to write these things down with what we call divine inspiration, and then he inspired other great men and women to pass the Bible down throughout many generations so that you and I can be talking about it today. And one day it'll be your turn to pass the Bible down. So pay attention. Now, in chapter 1, we read about the story of creation and the book of Genesis. But before we get into the actual events of what happened and all that, let's talk about God for just a second. Now, God was around before any of the other creations. He was around even before time itself existed. That's a very difficult thing for us to understand because we live within time. So it's very hard for us to picture a world where time doesn't exist. But think about it like this. Think about the alphabet being written on a page. A, B, C, D, all the way to Z. Now, we have to live one day at a time. Day A, day B, day C, and so on and so forth. We can't skip ahead. We can't go backwards. It's one at a time, and it's in the same order. Well, God himself is the whole sheet of paper. So he can see the alphabet all at once. A and Z is the same to him. Past, present, and future, he can see it all at once. And so he's outside of time. He's outside the alphabet, while we're right in the middle of it, living each day at a time. So that's a way to try and help you understand how God exists outside of time. And he exists before any of the creations that he created that we're going to talk about here in a second. But we know that God wasn't lonely because we believe in the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So God had everything he needed. He was perfectly happy. But because he's a loving and good God, he wanted to share in that happiness. So he began to create things. And he created the angels. He created lots of different kinds of angels. You should have read about them in chapter 1. And the angels were a little bit like us, human beings in some ways, and a little bit not like us. They were not like us because they didn't have bodies. They're more spirits. You're probably familiar with angels. You probably see them as having bodies because you're used to seeing them in paintings and seeing statues of them and things like that, maybe around your church or at Christmas time. But they don't actually have those bodies. They're more just spirits, so they're a little bit different from us. But they were like us because they were given free will. Now, free will is the ability to decide what you want to do and not do. No one's forcing you to do one thing or the other. And that was true of the angels as well. Unfortunately, some of the angels abused this power. They abused this power of free will. There was a bad angel named Lucifer, and he actually led a rebellion against God. He and some of these other bad angels, they didn't want God to be their master. They didn't want to be obedient to him. They thought they could be their own master. They were suffering from the sin of pride, right? But luckily, there was some good angels led by Michael, Saint Michael. And with the help of God, there was this angelic battle. And with the help of God, Michael was able to cast out Lucifer and all the other bad angels. Now, we're going to return to Lucifer in a little bit. But right now, let's step away and talk about what happened next. Then God began to create everything else. He created this book, the book of nature, basically, what we just talked about. He spent 7 days creating, or 6, and resting on the 7th. He also created the animals, right? Created the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea, and the cattle, and the wild animals. But eventually, he decided he wanted to create a creature in his likeness. So he created Adam. He created man. He gathered up the dust from the earth, and he breathed life into Adam. Now, his name means earthborn. Now, Adam was very happy at first. He had complete dominion over all the other animals. He got to name them, and he said, "I'm going to call that a bird and that a fish." And he was very, very happy right then. He was getting to frolic around the Garden of Eden, this paradise, this earthly paradise that God had created. But he began to feel a sense of loneliness because none of the other creatures were like him. He couldn't relate to any of them. And God picked up on this loneliness. So one day he sent Adam into a deep sleep, and he took a rib from Adam's side, and he created woman. Now, I want to read to you a passage because this is one of the most important passages in the Bible. It lays the foundation for the Christian family, and you'll probably hear this passage as you grow older. You'll probably hear it at weddings and things like that. This is the creation of Eve. So let me read this. Then God sent Adam into a deep sleep, and while he slept, God took one of his ribs and made woman from it. And when Adam awoke, God brought her to him. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, Adam said. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. This is why, ever since then, a man leaves his father and mother to join himself to a wife, and the husband and wife become one. a new family. Adam called his wife Eve, which means mother of all the living. So again, I just wanted to actually stop and read that passage to you because it's such an important one. And so Adam and Eve, they were now truly happy. They just like Adam was getting to before, they were frolicking around the Garden of Eden. They were enjoying all of God's creations. But the main reason they were happy is because they had a very special and unique and intense connection to God. It's actually impossible for me to describe this connection to God, and it's impossible for you to understand it because of what happens next in the story. But it was a sort of connection that gave them all the happiness and joy that they could possibly want. They were perfectly happy in what they had, perfectly content. But what happens next in the story is why you and I don't really understand it and don't experience that ourselves. Now, Eve one day was approached by a serpent. This, of course, was Lucifer. He had been watching from a distance, and he was jealous of Adam and Eve. He used to have this connection with God, and he had lost it, and he was miserable, and he wanted other people to experience his misery. And so he approached Eve with the intention of tricking her. He approached her, and he struck up a conversation, and he said, "Are there any trees in the garden that God told you to stay away from?" Now let's back up for a second. There was one tree, wasn't there? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God had warned Adam and Eve to stay away from this tree. He warned them that if they ate of it, they would die. Their bodies would wither and decay. They would suffer from disease, and they would die. And so the serpent knew this, and he knew what he was asking. He was kind of provoking Eve and sort of baiting her into this discussion. And so Eve answered the serpent. She said, "Yes, I'm not supposed to eat the fruit from that tree right over there. I'm supposed to stay away from it." And the serpent said, "Why?" And he said, she explained what God had told them, that they would die. And I'm going to read you what the serpent said. He said, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So again, he was trying to trick Eve. Now, we have to imagine that Eve probably had a little bit of curiosity about this tree at this point. Imagine going into a toy store and your parents tell you you can play with any toy except one. You'd be okay for a little while, but after a while you might be a little curious why you had to stay away from that one tree. That one toy. Now, the serpent knew that Eve was probably a little bit curious, and so he was playing up this part of her. And she began to think, yeah, why did God want me to stay away from that tree? Maybe the serpent's right. Maybe I would become all-powerful and all-knowledgeable like God, and God's just trying to keep me from being his rival. So she went to Adam and sort of explained what the serpent had said, and Adam agreed with Eve. He thought the same thing. Maybe God was trying to hold us down. So they took the apple and they ate of it. Now, immediately they knew they had done something wrong. You probably know that feeling. You don't even need your parents to come tell you when you've done something wrong. You have that feeling of guilt and shame a little bit, and you know what you've done. And Adam and Eve, they had this feeling. Now, before we go on any further, I should point out a similarity between Adam and Eve and some of those bad angels. Adam and Eve were also suffering from the sin of pride, right? They didn't want God to be their master. They thought they could become equals with God. And that was a similar experience to what happened with Lucifer and the angels. And it was Lucifer that sort of tempted Adam and Eve to sort of come into that sin with them. He almost made them a part of his family of pride and took them away from God's family. So we see that similarity there, and we'll see it in future stories as well. And the sin of pride is a terrible sin. It leads to many other sins. So Adam and Eve, knowing that they had done something wrong, feeling shameful and embarrassed, they went and hid, which is a little foolish, right? Because God knows where we are. He knows what's in our hearts. And so God came to them, and he asked, "What have you done?" Now, isn't that interesting that God asked what they had done? He was asking, why are they hiding, basically. But God knew what they had done, right? He's God. He's all knowledgeable. He was giving them a chance to fess up to what they had done, to take the blame for it and admit that they had done something wrong. But they didn't do that, did they? Adam blamed Eve. Well, she brought me the apple. Eve blamed the serpent. Well, the serpent tricked me. And isn't that what we do sometimes? Sometimes we blame our brother, our sister, our cousin, our friend, anything we can do to kind of get out of trouble from taking the blame of what we did. And that's what Adam and Eve did. And they didn't want to take any of the blame. But God knew that a punishment was in order. He knew what they had done. And so what he had promised was going to happen. Their bodies would wither and decay. They would suffer from disease. They would eventually die. And perhaps worst of all, they lost that connection with God, with Him that they had, and so they didn't have that joy. And the reason that you and I don't feel it, which is what I mentioned earlier, is because we believe that this sin that Adam and Eve created, this original sin, which is what we call it, is passed down from one generation to the next, and so that it's been passed down all the way to us. It's a very sad situation, but it is what happened. Now, of course, there were two people who were born without original sin, and you probably know who those are, but we won't talk about them yet. So God cast Adam and Eve out of the garden. This was part of the punishment as well. He punished the serpent, and the serpent has to slither around on his belly all the rest of his days. But he cast Adam and Eve out of the garden. He put an angel with a flaming sword at the entrance to the garden to keep them from coming back in. And so Adam and Eve were forced to wander the world and have this difficult life. Everything had been provided for them in the garden, and now they would be cast out, and they would have to make a new life for themselves, and it would be a very difficult one, filled with sadness and pain and many other horrible things. Now, that was chapter 1. In chapter 2, we're going to look ahead to Adam and Eve's descendants, their children, Cain and Abel, and the very sad story that awaits us there. We're going to talk about Noah and his ark, which is probably a story that you're very familiar with already, the great flood and all that. And then we're also going to touch on the Tower of Babel, which is another very interesting story of men wanting to build a building so high it touched the sky, but God had other plans for them. So go read chapter 2, and I'll see you in a little while.